Well, we're going to stay with this story as the Trump administration's decision on tariff follows accusations of unfair trade practices as well as rising tensions over South Africa's domestic policies. And these tariffs then could have a devastating impact on key industries, particularly the automobile sector, which has long benefited from duty-free access under the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, popularly known as AGOA. And I'm sure you heard, of course, our markets reporter there, Nompumelelo Siziba, referring to this very aspect of the hike increase. And as the new tariffs then are set to take effect soon, the critical question then becomes, can South Africa negotiate a resolution with Washington, or is this the start of a prolonged trade conflict? Well, helping us to further unpack this is Director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria, Professor Christopher Isike. Professor, welcome. Thank you so much for your time. So you and I have had enough time to actually look at the multiple reactions to the announcement of the 31% tariff hike announcement here in South Africa, at least by the United States. What was your reaction, judging also by the conditions that actually inadvertently led us to this position?
Well, good afternoon to us. Thank you for having me. Look, I wasn't surprised. The only thing that amused me was how US arrived at the 30% tariff rate for South Africa. All that the president said that he was halving reciprocal tariffs for countries that charge the US, charge them half the price or the tariff amounts that they charge the US. So South Africa's, I don't know of any South African product that charges or tariffs the US 60%. So now I require that South Africa will pay 30% if half of tariff charge to the US was the logic. Mm-hmm. So it's not surprising because, like I said, the US has trained its eyes on South Africa right from the time that Trump assumed office, and there were many of the things to see the strained relations would have impacted on some of the actions it's taken against South Africa, irrespective of what South Africa does or does not do.
Mm-hmm. You know, Professor, there's been a lot of calls saying that the time for diplomatic engagements is over, and it is time for South Africa to do what the rest of these nations that were given those tariff hikes to do, retaliatory hikes as well. What do you say to this?
Well, that's an option, but it depends on what we can, impose tariffs on. We just heard the ministers talk about certain critical minerals that South Africa exports to the US, that the US needs from South Africa, that are not in this tariff regime. So the US has been very careful in excluding them because they know that it would affect them negatively. So what South Africa should do is to use those ones as bargaining chips to bargain for what South Africa would need from the US. And if all else fails, then also adopt the same retaliatory or reciprocal tariff regimes that the US has imposed on South Africa.
I mean, our ministries, I'm sure you heard their reaction on this matter, Professor, have actually tried to be very diplomatic. I mean, as diplomatic as possible. And I know we've been having these conversations with the likes of yourself as well. And you were all along saying, advising for extreme caution when we talk about these matters. But I mean, what else can we do? Because, I mean, firstly, the United States does not want to engage bilaterally or diplomatically with South Africa, unless, of course, South Africa drops its ICJ case on Israel, along with the slew of other conditions that have actually been cited before they actually engage. So what is the point, really, and how can we maneuver out of this situation?
Well, the point about the ICJ case is that even if South Africa withdraws now, that case is still going to go on because there are other countries that have joined in. So that's really out of the table. The caution that I've really talked about is not for South Africa to remain foolish and weak in the eyes of the US, because as we know, Trump does not respect weak countries or weak leaders, as the case may be. The caution I have expressed is for South Africa to not be the first to throw the salvo go, but to respond in like manner, like it always is indicated that South Africa should not be in a hurry to appoint a new ambassador, for South Africa to wait for the US to show its hand and then use that as a bargaining chip to also put in someone that South Africa would prefer to have, whether the US like that person or not. So you have to be guarded. Now, the way things are, and I must tell you, I'm also getting tired of talking about Trump and America, South Africa, every time Trump does something. I think maybe we're giving him too much credit, and I think that we should start focusing on alternatives, the things that South Africa can do to increase its own value proposition, diversify its trade, and especially looking at AFTA. That will actually mitigate a lot of the effects that will come from South Africa's suspension from or removal from AGOA, which is very imminent, and other difficulties that have come out of this. But for me, that's what we should really be talking about. Now that the US has shown its hand in this regard, South Africa should be tough in using those critical minerals position, the absolute advantage that it has. The US absolutely needs those minerals, and so South Africa should be able to use them as leverage to negotiate what it wants. And if it doesn't get its way, it should then reciprocate in terms of also tariffing those. And I have said, and I'm going to say it again, that all these missions we keep sending to Washington, D.C. are fruitless. They're not going to be helpful because President Trump and Marco Rubio have made up their mind about South Africa. No matter what you do, they are not going to respond. So the best thing is to try and begin to diversify our trade, look for that trading partners, while also being cautious in our engagements with them. And if things get out of hand, for us to push the levers of reciprocity that we still have to push. So it's not going to be a complete position of weakness, but we should not be as beggarly. Otherwise, it will be counterproductive in the end.
Absolutely, because a lot of conversations around this action by the United States, Professor, self-isolating itself. Also, it's going to bear the brunt on its very own citizens there, with inflation set to skyrocket. This was not only a major just geopolitical, but also financial shockwave as well. So talk to us about the immediate impact on both consumers as well as businesses in light of these announcements, Professor.
Well, so tariffs are protectionist measures or policies that are put in place by a host country to promote domestic industry and create, economic opportunities that can then lead to creating prosperity for the countries involved. But what then happens is that no country in the world is completely self-sufficient. And that's why people like David Ricardo develop theories around absolute competitive and comparative advantages. That's encourage countries to try and focus on where they have competitive, advantage, and then trade with one another, to enable global prosperity. And this is how the world has operated in the last 100 years, and it has largely benefited the United States because of how advanced its economy was in leveraging this globalist outlook towards trade. Now that it is now retracing itself to protectionism, if every country was to do that, it will also harm the United States, because countries reserve the right, as we have seen many of them do, to also increase tariffs, and that will impact on the US. In fact, Trump did not even know how much electricity Canada, for example, was providing to the US. He was shocked by that, and that's another example of how integrated globalization has made the world to be. So this kind of protectionism will not help many countries of the world, because no one has absolute advantage. It will now have to be a cost-benefit analysis in terms of how much tariff you want to put on particular goods and services you get from a country, and how much you will suffer if they retaliate. Now, on the South African side, our trade with the US make up about 9% of the country's total exports, by value, and that comes to about 2.7% of our GDP, and it's not a not a small number, despite the fact that we're talking 2.7. But one of the things that South Africa should look to do, like I said before, is to find ways to diversify.
Be self-sufficient.
Yeah, be self-sufficient. That's what I'm saying. But also diversify our trading partners, because, like I said, we are not self-sufficient in everything, but we have other opportunities, even within Africa. If we are to start talking about how to maximize and leverage on the trade opportunities that AfTA presents, it will offset some of the implications, the hardships that our economy will suffer in terms of industries that may close down, youth unemployment that will arise as a result, given our already high unemployment rate. But it's time to really stop talking and stop massaging anyone's egos and start doing the work of making South Africa as strong as it can be, looking at just Africa alone. And of course, you have Europe that have come to the play. You have China, who are our biggest trading partners, and even the United Arab Emirates and other Gulf countries who have shown an interest.
Absolutely. And it says for ordinary South Africans, the effects will be felt not only in export margins, Professor, but in inflation, employment, as well as interest rate policies. So quite a lot to take in there for the average consumer. Professor, we really appreciate your input this afternoon. That is Professor Christopher Isike, Director at Access UP, on the US's latest tariffs on South Africa.